You are just a dead head. A no body. Hello, I don't know if the first part of that line was correct, but the second part I think was correct. Hello, huge movie fanatic Nate coming at you to review the sequel to Re-Animator, which is, of course, by the name of Bride of Re-Animator. Now, this is the only version of this movie, interestingly enough, I've ever owned, which is the original live VHS from 1990. I think in my Re-Animator review I said that it came out in 91. Maybe it was very late 1990. It seemed like it came out in 91. At any rate, I didn't see the movie until sometime in 1991, but I remember video stores actually, being adorned with this particular poster for Bride of Re-Animator, and still thinking now in 2017, 17 years, or actually that's 27, gosh, 27 years later, that this is actually some really kind of cool cover art. And what's really ironic about this is that just like with the first movie, Jeffrey Combs is in the credits, and Jeffrey Combs, he's the last billing for casting. Well, how come and Jeffrey Combs is the only, big kind of face featured on the cover? It's kind of ironic. But I remember thinking, like in 91 when I first saw this cover, that the artwork, and even still 27 years later, is really kind of cool and just colorful. And there's your, again, another big picture of Anne Jeffrey Combs, the last person featured in the credits, on the back. But I really still now even think this artwork is really just kind of cool and colorful. And here's a spine. Here's the other spine. And this, of course, obviously is the unrated version. I've never seen the R-rated version of Bride of Re-Animator as far as I know. So obviously after, revisiting Re-Animator with the fantastic new Arrow Video Blu-ray release, I was kind of curious to revisit Bride of Re-Animator, a title that I haven't seen for quite a long time. I have no idea. I probably haven't seen this since the DVD came out. And obviously when that happened, it should show you kind of how I feel about this movie, is because this is the most recent version of this movie that I have, and I know that Arrow Video put out a Blu-ray, strangely in backwards order. Arrow Video actually put out a release of Bride of Re-Animator, and I contemplated getting it several times, and I just looked at the screenshots of the Blu-ray, and I was just like, and having kind of revisited this movie, I'm kind of glad I didn't get the Blu-ray of this movie. This movie was actually directed by Brian Usna, the main producer of the first movie. It's obviously Stuart Gordon was probably busy or what, and maybe even if he hadn't been, maybe he wouldn't have been interested in doing this anyway. But this movie is actually directed by the guy who produced the first one, Brian Usna, and it's actually, having revisited it, the direction and kind of just the overall kind of movie-makingness about the movie isn't, completely horrible, and it's kind of, better than I remember it in a lot of cases. This movie's kind of a mess. Now, obviously, at the end of Re-Animator, the dean of the school crushes Dr. Hill's head, and Herbert West was presumed to have died. Of course, that was kind of more of a mystery shrouded in fog and steam and smoke and stuff, so that wasn't as concrete as seeing Dr. Hill's head crushed and just thrown against the wall and splatting on the ground, which was more concrete of a, kind of a demise. So after that happened, I was just kind of like, oh, well, so much for a sequel. And then, not long, of course, after I saw the original, I'd see this poster and this kind of, cover art in the video stores. I'm like, oh, okay. And at the time, being 14, I was not too picky about really. Obviously it was kind of like, well, Herbert West died and Dr. Hill's dead, so how are they going to do this? But they do mention kind of like Dr. Hill had a crushed skull or something like that. Like, his skull was crushed. No, it was like completely, his whole head was completely crushed. But at least they kind of, I think that was their way of trying to say keep a little bit of continuity. And like I say, we didn't see, what happened to Herbert West at the end of the day. So I guess it's not too big of a cheat. Now this movie kind of reminds me of Batman Returns, to be honest, where I just feel like it juggles way too much shit. You kind of deal with this is supposed to be like 8 months, I think, after the events in the first movie, and Dan and Herbert are still living in the same house. Of course, this movie, which was something that wasn't obviously in the first movie, which is they obviously just developed for this movie, which is kind of a cool idea, is that their house that they, I think they're supposed to be in the same house in this one that they were in the first movie. In this movie, we see, or it's revealed that it's like conveniently located right next to a cemetery. So in the basement, Herbert West can kind of, go through the brick wall and kind of go right into the like underground mausoleum to get just body parts and shit. I mean, this movie's got, it's kind of cool where it deals with a lot of stuff, and that's kind of my problem with it. It doesn't really know what it wants to deal with and just go with it. It's like all kinds of stuff. Having revisited it, I was really surprised how little Dr. Hill played a role in this movie. Obviously I knew he was in the movie, and I was just like, oh my gosh, the head is kind of reanimated by this other Dr. Graves. This Dr. Graves, just all we do is every now and then we cut back to him just sitting around in his office or whatever, and he, I can't remember how Dr. Hill's head actually, this fat kind of cop whose wife was supposedly killed in the Miskatonic Massacre, the thing at the end of the scene at the end of the first Re-Animator movie, finds Dr. Hill's head, and I can't remember where, in the trash somewhere or something like that, and brings it to Dr. Graves. So this movie is basically about, among other things, this fat kind of cop's vendetta against, you really trying to look into, see what caused what's called the Miskatonic Massacre in this movie, because he wants to, bring his dead wife justice, presumably, even though she clearly isn't one of the actors in the first movie, she's probably like one of the, I think they like to say she's one of the reanimated zombies from the end scene of Re-Animator, when of course that's not the case, or at least from what I can see. So he's got this vendetta, even though, apparently he was a wife beater anyway, and, abused her himself. I guess, that doesn't matter. He can abuse her, but as long as, if someone else abuses her or kills her, well, then he's got this vendetta. So it's kind of goofy. But, so among other things, this movie kind of revolves around this fat cop who's just kind of like a pain in the ass, who's just snooping around, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And once he brings Dr. Hill's head to this Dr. Graves, somehow he comes across the reagent and reanimates Dr. Hill's head, which actually, the effects for like the neck and shit is really, really, really top notch in this movie. Unlike the first one, where it's kind of like, it's just kind of like this, flat rubber extended thing or whatever. Like the effects for Dr. Hill's severed head in this movie are really, really great. The little bit you actually kind of see of him, most of the time he's on the head's on a desk talking to Dr. Graves, but the neck that they do for the front shot of like, the severed neck looks really good. A movie effects here, whereas maybe the first one was kind of a lot of times dealing with Dr. Hill, the effect of like the severed head and stuff maybe was more kind of B-movie effects, which, most of the time were really, really effective, but in this movie it's just like top notch. So, like I say, trying to deal with all of the plot points that are in this movie, you got, this fat, middle-aged, cop who, his wife was killed in the Miskatonic Massacre, basically snooping around looking for revenge. And then you've got Herbert West and Dan Kane still living together, and Herbert West having discovered an underground easy way to get to the, the underground corpses and shit in the mausoleum, or whatever the hell you want to call the underground. That's what an underground grave place is called, right? He's all into, in this movie, reanimating just like body parts, which of course would go on to the, kind of go on to be what the whole movie is about in terms of its title, Bride of Re-Animator. Now obviously when I first saw this title, I was like, oh, well, they reanimate Megan Halsey from the first movie. That makes a lot of sense. And having revisited it, that is partly the case. Dan Kane is still actually kind of, it's only 8 months later, still more or less incredibly grief-stricken about, Megan's death and stuff. And, there's this, Herbert West comes across this kind of body parts in, I think it's other guy's, Dr. Graves' office or something like that, or freezer or whatever. he finds, you know, Dr. Hill's head, and he finds all these kind of body parts from the Miskatonic Massacre, and just conveniently sitting there is Meg Halsey's heart, which I don't know why they'd cut that out and just, you know, put it in storage or whatever, but it's just a movie, whatever, it doesn't really matter. So then, you know, Herbert West finds it, takes it upon himself to take Meg's heart, and you know, Herbert West at the beginning of this movie is really into just reanimating parts, which is kind of a, you know, new thing, obviously, something that wasn't explored in the first movie, and it's kind of humorous, I guess, the famous scene of animated by Dave Allen, or at least Dave Allen Productions, where Herbert West puts, I think, like 4 fingers together and a thumb and an eyeball, and kind of, you know, puts some reagent on it and kind of reanimates that, and in a relatively well animated scene, and a funny scene that's kind of, the thing runs away and it's kind of suspenseful as the cop shows up, and it's just the, you know, it's this funny scene where it's kind of, you know, I guess it works or whatever, where they're trying to make sure the cop doesn't see this reanimated eyeball with on the fingers and the thumb for a tail running around. And so basically, I don't know what if the discovering of Meg's heart is what really prompts Herbert West to want to make a woman. Regardless, it's kind of what he uses. You know, needing Dan's help, kind of what he uses to make Dan help him. Or, you know, Herbert West is such a good manipulator of Dan, knows how to pull his strings, if you will, that he presents Dan with Meg's heart and says, you know, puts it on the, you know, like in the middle of the table where it would be if a woman was laying on it, and says, we can create, you know, like piece by piece, kind of like the movie pieces, except in this case they're going to make one and bring it to life or whatever, much like obviously Bride of Frankenstein. We can create a woman, you know, and Meg's heart can beat again, which is of course something that, I guess it's kind of realistic. Or I mean, you kind of fall for, you know, the fact that Dan fell for it in the way he fell for it or whatever. So this is what I'm talking about. You know, it deals with basically these, you know, maybe even more, but all I can really remember are these 3 main points, which is kind of trying to squeeze Dr. Hill into the movie again, and trying to, you know, do a movie where you're dealing with, you know, Dan's grief over, you know, losing Meg, and that being a factor in him being all kind of, you know, maybe beyond the call of doctor duty with this one terminal patient who's actually Kathleen. I didn't know at the time when I first saw this movie, but it's actually Kathleen Kinmount, who would be that hot, sexy, a couple of years prior, was that hot, sexy, buxom chick in Halloween 6, which was just a calamity the way she teased us with her tits, and then we didn't get to see anything. A couple years later, we get to see him kind of, you know, be disrobed or whatever in a couple seconds shot of, you know, them ripping off her clothes to try to save her life. But Jesus Christ, all these details. So anyway, I mean, it's really, you know, I guess, like I say, it's just, in my opinion, just trying to put too much into this movie. So Dan Kane's all, you know, hubba kind of clinging to this terminal patient because, you know, in his eyes he's kind of like, you know, another chance to save Meg, even though it's really, you know, ridiculous because it's not Meg, it's this Kathleen Kinmount, you know, a different character who's terminal or whatever. So then conveniently, you know, sometime along the lines of the movie, she dies, of course, and they basically take all these different body parts. I'm not going to, you know, describe each one and where it came from and shit, but long story short, they take all these body parts and sew them together with Meg's heart, and basically this Kathleen Kinmount's, of course she's playing the whole thing with makeup and shit, but then Kathleen Kinmount's character dies, and they take his, you know, Herbert West takes her head to really kind of solidify the deal with Dan, and, you know, unveils it, you know, this body with basically this Kathleen Kinmount, you know, Dan's former terminal patient's head on it, and he's just like, oh my god, when Dan sees that, which is realistic, and then he's like, yes. You know, it's kind of unrealistic how Dan keeps being drawn into this madness by Herbert West, but I guess he's very motivational speaker or whatever. But so you're dealing with, you know, minimum 3 of these kind of plot points that are all trying to, and I was really surprised how little Dr. Hill was in it. I mean, basically he tries to hypnotize this Dr. Graves to do his dirty work, and then at some point along the line, this fat cop, who's on the vendetta, shows up and shows up to Dan Kane's and Herbert West's place, and there's a fight where he's actually killed and his arm chopped off or whatever, and then, oh gosh, I forgot to mention this hot, buxom kind of sexy Italian chick who's really hot, and she was actually in a commercial in RoboCop 2. These are the only two things I think I've seen her in. Basically the same year she was in this, kind of one of their funny commercials for the Sunblock 2000 or whatever the hell it is, add a pint to your body and you're good for hours or whatever. She's in that commercial in RoboCop 2 and also basically plays the female hottie in this movie, who is like really attractive, and we get teased with like laying in bed after like a sex scene with Dan. Kind of, I don't know if it's her or double because her face is kind of turned away from camera, but I don't know. Whoever breast we get to see in that scene where Dan's kind of like, oh, you're so soft and so whatever, and just kind of a breast tee shot or whatever. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. So she's got this dog, and in a funny kind of Brian using a joke, they kind of do this thing where the dog's arm gets ripped off, and then this cop's hand gets cut off, and it's actually like the dog's front right paw, and it's this guy's right hand. So then Herbert West attaches the fat cop's hand to the dog, and it's just like, that's kind of funny, I guess, and creative or whatever. And oh my gosh, this movie's kind of a mess. You know how I mentioned, if you saw my review for Re-Animator, how that movie's got so much of just a straightforward, head-on, just knows what it's doing, and it just like a freight train, like a locomotive, just barrels forward at just like 100 miles an hour on the train tracks, knowing exactly where it's going. It's got a straight line. The plot of that movie is just so frickin', in the final movie, so frickin' concise and knows exactly where it's going. This movie is like the exact opposite, where it's just like, okay, we've got all these things we want to deal with, and which one do we want to deal with at what point? And Dr. Hill gets really put back into the background, is kind of the third main thing in this movie, and kind of the thing that's really just almost forgotten about. At some point, Dr. Graves reanimates a dead bat. I don't know where he gets this thing. He just has it, whatever. And it flies around the room, and he cuts off its wings to try to, I guess, keep it from flying around, I guess. And later on, towards the end of the movie, this is what I was saying before, is at some point throughout the movie, halfway through or whatever, this cop who's investigating everything comes to Dan Kane's and Herbert West's house and gets basically killed and reanimated. So basically, when Dr. Hill can't hypnotize Dr. Graves to do his bidding, he's just like, looks up into looks up and kind of just like, I guess, acquires the mind of, it's a really weak plot point where basically Dr. Hill can just basically look up and, go into a trance-like state and just like, tune in to any zombie, recently reanimated zombies within the tri-state area, or the immediate vicinity. And of course, that cop just having been killed and reanimated, wandering the graveyard wandering around, and then you got these, presumably these, zombies, which were supposed to have been zombies from the end of part, the Miskatonic Massacre from the first movie. You kind of got them into place, so you kind of have a remake of towards the end of the movie, kind of just like the remake of how the first one ends, is with maybe 3 or 4 zombies, attacking people, and then obviously at the end of the movie with thunder and lightning and shit, they bring, they bring to life the creation with Kathleen Kinmount's, it's her whole, she plays obviously the whole thing, but in the movie it's like Kathleen Kinmount's character's head attached to all these body parts with Meg's heart, whatever. Ever since I first saw it, I always found, and still having revisited it, I was actually, a lot of things in movies don't really get to me, but I kind of found that the scene where they actually kind of reanimate the bride of Re-Animator in this movie, I always found that to be actually, I don't know, I guess maybe it's a testament to its effectiveness, but I always found that scene to be actually kind of hard to watch, where it was just like this creation of all these women body parts all sewn together and reanimated. Doesn't even want to be reanimated. And Kathleen Kinmount does a good job at doing the kind of Bride of Frankenstein neck movement, and just in general kind of the tacked together just frickin' body parts trying to walk and do all this stuff. And God, what a pain in the ass all that makeup must have been for her to wear and stuff like that. But yeah, I've never liked the end of the movie, kind of where it's just like she's in the movie and she's, all hot to trot for Dan, and I guess because it's, his Kathleen Kinmont's character's head and, Meg's heart or whatever, and Herbert West feels like, he never gets any of the women. He's like, I created you, and she's like flocking to Dan. All the girls always flock to Dan, and Herbert just, got, who knows what never mind. Oh my gosh, this movie's just kind of a mess in my opinion. Dr. Hill, towards the end of the movie, he has one of his zombie minions that he controls by telepathy, sew them conveniently severed bat wings onto the side of his ears, or the side of his head rather, like he'd be able to, it makes no sense, but obviously either does a head that's living and communicating with other zombies. That doesn't make sense either, so why not attach bat wings to a head and fly around and whatever. I will say that it's a bummer. Obviously David Gale wasn't going to be alive. Of course they didn't know that at the time, but wasn't going to be alive too much longer, and in retrospect, knowing that, it's a shame that he was so underplayed in this movie. But again, what are you going to do? I mean, I guess if you had David Gale or Dr. Hill be the bad guy in this movie primarily, again, it'd be just kind of a rehash. So I mean, I guess you got to give him props for kind of doing something different in this movie. It's just, from what they do, in my opinion, isn't particularly interesting, and I don't really like the kind of reanimating the bride of Re-Animator, if you will, and some of the majority of the stuff in this movie doesn't really interest me. Is it Herbert West at his greatness? Like in the first movie, not as much. I mean, he walks back into the role pretty convincingly. But the thing that I don't, thing that doesn't, for me, touch the greatness of Jeffrey Combs in the first movie is his, the scenes where he's all excited and just like, really just high energy and excited in the first movie are just brilliantly acted by Jeffrey Combs. This movie, I don't think there's really any Herbert West like that, because they're so far into the game now where it's kind of just like reanimating stuff is kind of just, nothing to it. So I guess there's really no that I can remember, any high energy Herbert West in this movie. But, Jeffrey Combs still, steps into the role, that very kind of cold, just mechanical thing where that Kathleen Kinmont's like, oh, my head's about the only thing of me that isn't sick, and then Herbert West takes a look at her eyes and he's like, you're correct, your head part of you is quite well. So he's he's definitely does a good job at Herbert West in this movie, stepping back into the role, but just from what I can remember doesn't have many or at all, if at all, any of them kind of high energy, just fantastic Herbert West moments. So stars for this movie, oh gosh, we'll go 2 1/4 stars out of 4 stars for Bride of Re-Animator. I mean, if I could come across the Arrow Blu-ray for like, I don't know, 20 or less, I'd potentially buy it. Oh gosh, one of the things actually in the special features that I'm really interested in, actually maybe I will buy it after the fact, or at the end of the day, is like, I think there's 2 commentaries with Herbert West, like one of them with the director, and then one of him with the guy who plays, Bruce Abbott, and so I think there's like at least 1 commentary, if not 2, with, did I say Herbert West? I mean Jeffrey Combs, which of course, I love listening to him do a commentary. I like the first one and stuff. So maybe, maybe if nothing else, just get this Blu-ray feel free to let me know if if you've seen heard the commentaries and for this release, if they're any good. Like, I think there is one where it's just like Jeffrey Combs and Bruce Abbott, and then there might be another one with like Brian Usna and Jeffrey Combs or something like that. And then, so yeah, if nothing else, maybe this release or the Arrow video releases would be good for the just commentary. But that's I probably went on way too long. That's my review for Bride of Re-Animator. And yes, I do own the DVD of Beyond Re-Animator, and just being an anal bastard, I probably will revisit that and be back to review the last of the Re-Animator movies, or at least, well, I would imagine it's going to probably be the last Re-Animator movie, yet again directed by Brian Usna, I think shot in, I don't know what, Spain or something like that. The same place he would do Rottweiler or whatever. So feel free to let me know what you think about this movie. Do you have the Arrow video Blu-ray? And if so, how is that? I mean, how are the special features? How are the commentaries? They tried, and like the effects and are pretty darn good, like gore effects and makeup effects, and when they're stop motion, they're pretty good and stuff like that. So it's a solid effort or whatever. But in my opinion, I just don't like when movies are this cluttered. I guess is what it boils down to. So thank you very much for watching my review, and as always, we'll catch you next time.